The smell hit you before the sight did, a sweetness so thick it coated the back of your throat, a rotting perfume that clung to your clothes and followed you home. In the spring of 1348, if you walked through the streets of Florence, you would have stepped over bodies, not one or two, dozens, piled against doorways, slumped in alleys, bloating in the April sun. Fathers left daughters on the street, mothers sealed their doors against their own children. The churches ran out of consecrated ground, so they dug trenches, stacked the dead like cargo in the hold of a ship, sprinkled a thin layer of dirt, and stacked more. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived those months, wrote that the city had become a vast open grave, and that the living walked among the dead as though death itself had lost all meaning. This was not a metaphor. This was Tuesday in Florence, and Florence was not special. The same scene was unfolding in Siena, in Venice, in Marseille, in London, in Bergen, in Moscow. Across the entire continent, something was killing Europe, and no one, not a single physician, priest, or king, understood what it was or how to stop it. To understand why the Black Death became the most catastrophic biological event in recorded human history, you have to understand the Europe it walked into. By the early 14th century, the continent was more connected, more populated, and more prosperous than it had been since the fall of Rome. The population had swelled to roughly 75 million people, maybe more. Cities like Paris housed over 200,000 souls. London had perhaps 80,000. Trade routes threaded from the wool markets of Flanders to the spice bazaars of Constantinople. The champagne fairs in France were the beating commercial heart of the West. Genoa and Venice had built maritime empires that stretched across the Mediterranean, their ships carrying silk, grain, gold, and slaves between dozens of ports. The great cathedrals, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, were either freshly completed or still rising, monuments to a civilization that believed God had blessed its expansion. Europe felt full, Europe felt confident, and that fullness, that confidence, was precisely what made it so vulnerable. The first pillar of vulnerability was overpopulation itself. By 1300, Europe had pushed its agricultural capacity to the breaking point. Every available acre had been cleared, plowed, and planted. Forests that had stood since antiquity were felled for farmland. Marginal soils, thin, rocky, and prone to flooding, were cultivated out of sheer necessity. When the climate turned colder in what historians call the Little Ice Age, harvests collapsed. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions across northern Europe. Entire villages starved. In England, reports described people eating dogs, cats, and tree bark. The population that survived was weakened, malnourished, immunologically fragile. They were kindling waiting for a spark. The second pillar was connectivity. Those same trade routes that carried wealth also carried rats. And inside those rats lived fleas. And inside those fleas lived Yersinia pestis, a bacterium so efficient at killing that it remains one of the deadliest pathogens ever to infect a human host. The bacterium had been circulating in rodent populations across Central Asia for centuries, perhaps millennia. But in the 1340s, something changed. Mongol armies, moving westward, pushed infected rodent populations into new territories. The disease reached the Crimean port of Kaffa in 1346, where Genoese merchants maintained a trading colony. The Mongol commander Jani Beg, besieging the city, made a decision that remains one of history's earliest recorded acts of biological warfare. He catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls. The Genoese fled by sea, carrying the disease with them to Constantinople, to Messina, to Genoa itself, to Marseille. By 1347, the plague had arrived in southern Europe. By 1348, it was everywhere. The killing was extraordinary in both speed and scale. The bubonic form produced swellings the size of eggs in the groin, armpits, and neck, the infamous buboes, that turned black and oozed blood and pus. Roughly 60% of those infected this way died within a week. But there was also a pneumonic form, transmitted through the air itself, through coughs and breath. And this version killed nearly everyone it touched, often within 48 hours. Imagine a disease where you develop a fever at breakfast and are dead before the following dawn. Physicians were helpless. They prescribed bloodletting, herbal poultices, the burning of aromatic herbs. Some believe the plague was caused by a miasma, a poisonous corruption of the air itself, perhaps triggered by an earthquake or a sinister alignment of planets. They had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of contagion as we know it. The very rats scurrying beneath their floorboards, the very fleas biting their skin. These were invisible mechanisms of death that would not be understood for another 500 years. The numbers are staggering even now. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death killed an estimated 25 to 50 million Europeans, somewhere between a third and half of the entire continental population. Some regions were hit even harder. In parts of Italy and southern France, mortality may have reached 70 or 80%. The English village of Am, the Tuscan city of Siena, entire communities were functionally erased. Agnolo di Tura, a chronicler in Siena, wrote that he buried his 5 children with his own hands, and that so many died, there was no one left to mourn. Think about that. Not the number, but the texture of it. A father digging 5 small graves. Oh, a city so emptied that grief itself became impossible because grief requires someone alive to feel it. The social fabric disintegrated. Boccaccio described how all laws of God and man seemed to dissolve. People abandoned the sick without remorse. Priests refused to administer last rites. Some turned to wild hedonism, drinking and feasting as though pleasure could ward off death. Others turned to fanatical penance. The flagellants marched through German and Low Country towns, whipping themselves bloody, convinced that only extreme suffering could appease an angry God. And then there was the scapegoating. Across Central Europe, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells. In Strasbourg alone, on Valentine's Day 1349, an estimated 2,000 Jews were burned alive on a wooden platform in the Jewish cemetery. The massacre spread to Basel, of Freiburg, Cologne, and dozens of other cities. The plague killed indiscriminately, but human cruelty chose its targets with precision. And yet, the Black Death did not merely destroy, it transformed. With a third of the labor force dead, the survivors found themselves in sudden demand. Peasants who had been bound to the land for generations could now negotiate wages, move to new estates, demand better conditions. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 tried desperately to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but it was unenforceable. The feudal system, already creaking, began its long collapse. Land that had been scarce was now abundant. Rents fell, diets improved as fewer mouths competed for the same resources. Per capita wealth actually rose. The Black Death, in a terrible irony, has improved the material conditions of those it did not kill. The intellectual aftershocks were equally profound. Faith in the Church, which had proven utterly powerless against the plague, weakened across Europe. The seeds of the Reformation, still a century and a half away, were planted in the mass graves of 1348. Art turned darker, more obsessed with mortality. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a dominant motif, skeletons leading kings and peasants alike to the grave, a reminder that no wealth, no title, no prayer could exempt you. Medicine, too, slowly began to shift. The failure of traditional Galenic remedies pushed some physicians toward empirical observation, toward asking not what the ancient texts said, but what their own eyes could see. It was a slow turn, agonizingly slow. But it pointed toward a world where knowledge came from evidence rather than authority. Standing here now, nearly 7 centuries later, there is something uncomfortably familiar about the story. A connected world caught off guard by a pathogen it did not understand. Cities emptied, economies frozen, conspiracy theories flourishing in the vacuum left by inadequate information, the desperate search for someone to blame. The frontline workers, the priests, the physicians, the gravediggers of 1348, dying at rates far higher than the general population because they could not do their jobs from a safe distance. We tell ourselves these are stories from a distant, primitive past, from a world that lacked our science, our medicine, our understanding. And that is partly true. But the Black Death endures in memory not because of what it tells us about the 14th century. It endures because of what it tells us about ourselves, about how fragile civilization remains when confronted with a threat it cannot see, cannot control, and cannot outrun. The dead of 1348 are silent now, But the world they left behind is the world we inherited, reshaped by their absence in ways we are still only beginning to understand. I'm Tim, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.